Hi Dayna, hi Mick.
Hello.
Hey Jack. Welcome to Pip.
Thanks.
Today we're chatting about feeding and mealtimes, and it's a really big topic and one that I guess felt would be interesting to talk about because it's one of those things that often OTs don't feel overly comfy in unless they've done additional training in feeding therapy, I suppose. So I thought I'd kick off by asking you both what you think, in your opinion, OTs should be doing or know when it comes to feeding challenges. Just a big question to get us started.
I guess, and we'll get into that into a bit more detail in a bit, but assessment is so important. And starting off going, we don't know all the answers straight off the bat, and taking the time to unpack that with the parents, with the care team, like what do they already know? Are they already seeing things that maybe, from a speechy perspective, from a psych perspective, that we can work with and unpack from an OT lens? I think that's really, really important to get curious about that and spend time actually exploring that rather than jumping into intervention straight away.
Yeah. And I think just knowing that like OTs can actually work on feeding and meal times, ideally in like a multidisciplinary setting, but you can do it by yourself. Like just as an OT with your clients, whether it's clinic-based or community, we can do it and we do have the skills to be able to. So I think that's important to know and build your confidence with that and not shy away from it, even though, we're not speechies or psychologists, but we do have a role in it. I think it's important.
Yeah, it's one of those ones, we shy away from it as it's an ADL, isn't it?
Yeah, it's actually it's an occupation.
Yeah, that's right. So we know being OTs, we've got lots of OTs that do listen, but we actually have a lot of different clinicians. And I think that's why this is an interesting topic and why we want to build our skills as clinicians supporting kids that are having difficulties with feeding, because it is one of those topics where knowing what's within our scope when we're talking about such a complex thing that has psychological factors, it has oral factors. Sometimes we get very nervous when it comes to things that involve swallowing and, it's really a basic, one of the 4 pillars of health is nutrition. So we obviously want to do right by our clients, and sometimes that means that if we're not feeling super confident, we tend to just want to refer on. Do you find that, what is it about feeding therapy or dealing with feeding goals that is so scary?
Oh, it's a good question. I personally think it's because with a feeding challenge, there is a sometimes blurred line around whether it is an eating disorder or is it disordered eating. And as OTs, if it is an eating disorder, we have to refer on and involve other, like health professionals. So it can be scary, I guess, if you're not 100% sure what your scope is in assessment or what we're doing to, go over that line. So I think that is why sometimes it can be scary.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think being so aware that there are those signs that make disordered eating and eating disorders different to each other and not wanting to miss those. I think it is, like you said, Jack, it's great to jump in there and know that we are OTs and we're so equipped to work in this space. But yeah, knowing when that referral point is also why we should know that really well to then jump into it in that way. But I agree that makes it quite a daunting thing to take on sometimes.
Yeah.
Regardless of discipline, I think it's really important to note that how important that assessment process is, which I know you referred to, Dayna. And I think multi-dis assessment is potentially one of the reasons why we shy away as well, because we think that we're going to ask all these questions and potentially unpack things that maybe aren't within our scope. But I think a really thorough case history is super important, and we can, whether you've got other disciplines at your practice or not, you can provide that multi-dis assessment even outside of your practice. I know you've recently had a scenario, Mick, that kind of applied to. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I had a little girl come in and she'd been seeing me for a little while, but we decided to move to feeding. It was one of those goals that was constantly coming up. And I think if you go back to like your hierarchy of needs, with like basic needs being at the bottom and feeding it makes sense why you might work on other goals, but it always ends up coming back up. But we did a feeding assessment and she had lots of speech challenges, which was already something in my mind that I was thinking, what's going on, like oral motor, like with her oral motor skills. So what I did is we got some videos of her eating and just basically looked at as much as I could, like tongue patterns, her chew patterns, and it just didn't seem quite right. So from there, I had a discussion with the family and I did contact her speech therapist and we looked at it together, and she ended up getting a full oral motor assessment with her speech therapist. And there was a lot going on that explained challenges with eating, speech.
So interesting.
Even though we won't necessarily look at like oral motor skill development, as a specific skill within our therapy at the moment, it means that now her speech therapist can. So I think that was a really good like opportunity to look at the whole picture around, okay, well, she's a picky eater, could be sensory, could be this, could be that. But a lot of it did stem from her oral motor skills, which was important for me to assess and refer on in that situation.
It comes back to our clinical reasoning, doesn't it, in terms of like noticing those. Sometimes it is just a bit of a gut feeling and sometimes it really is something that sticks out to us, and either way it's our job to do no harm and tick the boxes and do our due diligence to make sure that we are assessing properly and asking the right questions. What other things do you look at? I know you mentioned, taking a video, which is super helpful because you're able to actually, you weren't sure, so you could send it to the speechy with permission, obviously, and get their opinion. In addition to actually videoing them and watching them eat, what other things do you include in your assessment?
I often look at, medical history is really important, and often like that might already be available to us, but maybe it's contacting the pediatrician to find out a bit more. But I think also what's really important is understanding sensory preferences, and maybe we've done a sensory profile already, but maybe that is actually something that I include in the assessment process to understand how that could be impacting like eating behavior, and whether it's coming from a really low threshold for oral processing. That can be really important to know, but even the things around movement seeking and if that's impacting ability to actually engage in eating, and being able to understand that, rule that out like you said, and understanding then what else do I not know then, and going from there.
Yeah, I think the observation phase is so important because we're seeing what's going on. Like you were looking at like oral patterns. We're talking about, can the child, are they sitting for meal times? Are they avoiding? How are they responding to food? What are their preferences? What are they eating? What have they previously eaten? What's the cultural things around family meal times? And are there any history? Is there medical trauma? Those kinds of things that we ask and observe, and that forms all of our judgment around, okay, now we sort of know what we're seeing and potentially what's happened prior, and now we're starting to think about why. And that's where we really, sometimes it is just process of elimination and referral on, isn't it? Because we don't know why from the get-go. And often, like anything in pediatric therapy, when is it ever one thing? Like it's always a lot of things. It could be the oral motor skills, it could be sensory, it could be past medical trauma or trauma associated with meal times. It could be just a skill deficit. It could be attention, the ability to actually sit and attend. It could be social. And often it's a combination of all of those things. So I really like it's a very interesting aspect of therapy, I think, because there are so many things to unpack and come at it from all different angles. And as long as we're doing it safely and within our scope and referring on, I think it's important to note that there's no right way to actually address feeding necessarily. It's not really a prescriptive thing like most things we do, I suppose.
I think that even highlights even further how qualified OTs actually are to look into this, because we do cover so many occupations, and that's our job, to look at all the occupations and understand how that could be impacting the children. So I think that is huge for us then.
Yeah, I think even getting video of the family and what mealtimes looks like for them at home, so many environmental factors play a part often in feeding as well. Is there anything else that we need to think about when we're looking at that assessment?
The only other thing I'd add, obviously, you've said like you look at the child and what they're doing and then look at their environment and what foods they're actually presented with. And I think changing that food that they're presented with can change how they engage. So I think when you are doing any sort of assessment, having different foods available to do your assessment with, but also looking at the parent and almost like assessing them in a way or how they respond to their child. I think some of the statistics say that it's a really high number of times that a parent might prompt their child to eat during mealtimes or come on or sit down or do this. And just that added demand during mealtimes, you might not even realize that you're doing it. But looking out for those things and what the child actually responds well to versus what might, I guess, contribute to, I guess, a child pushing boundaries at mealtimes is important. But I think the other important thing to mention is that often when kids don't eat, the parent is blamed, which is generally only like the tiniest part of the problem. Usually it's a skill or one of those other things that we said, like, is it motor skills? Is it sensory? Is it medically like a challenge? So I think, looking at the parent and the family dynamic, but keeping in mind that generally it's only a small part of the picture.
And those secondary contributing factors, like it's like anything we work on, those things can absolutely be hindering progress potentially, or they're now a contributing factor. But I think we quickly jump to that being like the root cause.
Yeah.
And like Mikayla said, that's very rarely ever the reason why the child started exhibiting challenges with feeding. And I think there's a lot of developmental things wrapped up in feeding as well, that is, really important. We look at, typical milestones and those kinds of things. And a lot of the kids we support with neurodevelopmental conditions don't necessarily develop in the same way, they don't tick the same boxes. And even when it comes to learning to eat, I've got a toddler, and I know, like, when Mick was talking about that, I really resonated with sometimes when kids are having a low intake day, and how that can impact on sleep or their bedtime when they're saying they're hungry. And, I have all the theory in my head around don't apply pressure and, stress-free meal times and letting her like read her cues and responding to her own hunger cues. And sometimes I'm just like, just please have 3 more mouthfuls because you'll probably sleep better and you've barely touched your dinner.
Yeah.
So I can only imagine how parents who their child is starting to drop weight or have been to the doctor and they're really concerned about failure to thrive. And I've got parents even at Mothers Group that were really worried about their child's growth and how that stress can absolutely exacerbate the problem. And sometimes doing less is doing more, and that can be really hard to support a family in. I know when I did a workshop very early on in my career, and they often spoke about it was, I can't even remember who it's through. If I think of it, I'll put it in the speaker notes. And they were talking a lot about how they were speechies and they got referrals when clients no longer, I guess, were basically like their preferred foods were close to none. And it was almost the last resort where the kids were looking at almost being peg fed and hospitalization. And they were like, these speeches were saying, like, just give us a chance, like, let us take the pressure off. And it sometimes feels quite dangerous to look. And that's why I think it's important that we refer to the right professionals because they know what they're doing. But often to move forward, they sometimes feel like they need to go backwards. And when we're just like, please, you need to eat something today, and we're talking about taking the pressure off even further, we need to understand how distressing that can be for families that are already feeling the pressure of needing to feed their kids.
Yeah, and a lot of judgment too, I think, would come with that, because if they only want to eat chicken nuggets and a wrap or, chips, then around family and birthdays and things, it's like, oh, they should be having this and that. And it's
the
like
pressure from them, I'm sure.
Yeah, it stacks on. It keeps adding up.
I had a client that I supported a number of years ago and started school and was doing quite well, but had quite significant feeding challenges, diagnosed with ARFID, and his mum had to bring McDonald's to school every day at lunchtime and eat with him in the car. And the judgment around that and school perceiving that as such an issue for this child, when really it was something that just needed to happen for that child to be able to eat that day. And it wasn't, the family wasn't working on it. It wasn't that mum didn't share the hope that he would sit and eat with his peers. But sometimes you've just got to work with the child and their preferences and take a real child family centered approach and understand that everyone is doing the best they can.
I think that's why also an assessment, like Mick and I were just talking about before, but why parent education in those sessions to just unpack all of this, lay out the expectations and what the timeline's going to look like, sharing in the hope with the family, Cowie's famous line, but sharing in that hope with them that we want to get there, but actually it's okay that we're here right now and this is what that's going to look like, and really just making that invisible visible, because I think that is really tricky to navigate that alongside of also doing it at the same time. If you can all be on the same page from the get-go, then that's where that's really important as well.
We know that stress and anxiety can obviously just do horrendous things to our appetite and our willingness to eat. So a lot of feeding therapy often centers around reducing that cortisol and reducing stress around meal times. So that's one aspect of it. But also I think that's why it's nice to sometimes set goals that really have nothing to do with actual food intake, because that's one thing that when it comes to kids, I guess it's that whole like we provide, they decide. And I know there's exceptions to that when kids are, you know, extremely unwell. We need to look at other ways to actually make sure they're able to survive. But I think sometimes setting goals with families around that idea that sometimes the goal is around reducing stress at mealtimes, even for them. So what do you want mealtimes to look like? Moving away from goals of to eat this amount of food to having a stress-free family mealtime and what that can look like. What other sort of goals are appropriate to have within session?
It's a good question. I have been finding with some of my older clients, getting them involved and I guess including goals around changing their thinking around food, using like CBT strategies, and often like I'll like tell kids that like I'll use the analogy when they're like old enough to understand of when you are about to jump in a pool that's really cold. If you're standing on the edge and then you don't get in and then you just keep trying to jump in, it's really hard to do that gap. And it's a little bit like food. If there's a food there that you've avoided for so long and there's a lot of anxiety and stress around it, actually taking that leap to try it is going to be so scary. So I guess if you can go in and jump in and try, it's a lot easier to go back and do it. So I guess having goals around anxiety management and how to move a food from that zone of, I guess, like growth or stress and move it more into your comfort zone. And obviously there's lots of little steps in between that, and it could be exposure, having short-term goals around that, cognitive strategies around changing your thinking about what's going to happen when you try the food. Well, when you try it, it might be yuck. That's okay. It's expected. So having goals around that I think is important, especially as they start to get older and it moves away from play-based like feeding goals.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think definitely anxiety cycle has definitely been one that I've supported families understand the importance of looking at that, as well as I think interoception. And really some of my older kids that have come in my caseload and we looked at feeding goals has been, how aware are you of feeling full versus hungry? And then also just interoception in general, like actually being able to respond to what your body's telling you, and unpacking and doing some activities around building interoception. And that doesn't have to involve food straight away. That can look at touching cold things and like actually exploring how do those things feel and using some words to describe that, and then moving closer and closer to then trying that with food. I think that sometimes has been a really helpful place to start, especially when being able to be aware of sort of how your body is responding to food and knowing that, and not just jumping to like kind of what you're saying, Mikayla, around oh, I don't like what that tastes like, but actually what are the consistencies that we're like actually picking up when we're eating that food, or what is our body telling us, and what do we know about that? And then combining that with a bit of then like CBT strategies around that has been really helpful.
Yeah, it's really powerful to give kids a sense of autonomy and control over this, like any goal, and acknowledging that when it comes to mealtimes, that feels hard, and sitting with families in that discomfort, because it is hard to relinquish a little bit of control. But ultimately, it's very unlikely that they've had a lot of success with the things that they've tried in terms of coaxing and bribing and encouraging and forcing and, holding, desserts hostage until, or preferred, or even worse, like preferred foods until they've tried certain things. And so they're coming because they haven't had much success with those approaches. So yes, we're kind of undoing that, I guess, fear that is associated with mealtimes and the high stress that comes with it, and bringing the fun back to food, isn't it? It's such a social thing in our culture to eat. We're so confronted by it, from, little kids at kinder to all the way through to school, versus all our social things generally centre around food. So working with kids on being able to manage distress and implement strategies to allow them to also not miss out on social things or class-based activities because there's food there is also really helpful.
I think as well, a lot of my goals are framed around like parents understanding different things. Like I've done sometimes a whole term without seeing the child, and it's just, I guess, providing education and building their confidence so that when we actually start, they've got all the information and they can confidently go and practice at home. I think that's important as well.
I think you mentioned earlier disordered eating versus eating disorders, and I think that's something that OTs and other clinicians really need to consider heavily when working. So we've spoken a little bit about, I guess, assessment, and we've spoken a little bit about goal setting and making sure the goals are, affirming and child-led and family-centered. But then we're moving into the intervention, and I suppose there's diagnosed eating disorders, and obviously that means often referring on well and quickly. What are some of the services that we can think about that we might refer to kids when we have, I guess, even early red flags versus a diagnosed eating disorder?
I really like to refer families to the Butterfly Foundation, and from there is a checklist that you can complete for families can complete. Jackie, you might be able to remember the name of it. That basically you can print off, and it gives you a generated report that they can take to their GP, so that if they've got concerns around an eating disorder, they've got something physically that they can take. And I guess speaking about it as well, it's stressful. There's a lot of worry involved. So if there's something tangible that they can refer to when they're chatting with their GP or even pediatrician, I think it's a good way to go.
Feed your instincts.
That's it.
Nice.
Yeah.
I think it's got its own website, but I think you can refer to it from the Butterfly Foundation.
Yep.
There is a link. So that's a really good place. And if in doubt, GP is a good first point of call. And again, communicating clearly with GPs. So even if we need to write a quick email or write a quick letter that a family can take, because families often need that support to, from a clinical perspective, understand where they're potentially needing to be referred to and why we are concerned in the first place. I guess other services, if we're looking on the real eating disorder end of things and we're really concerned post-GP, where would you refer for more emergent concerns where we're really thinking this is significant worry and they probably need to present to the hospital, for example?
Yeah, I know Royal Children's, Austin Health, and Monash Health as well, I believe, do offer, I think, pediatric specific up until 18 years old services that do provide that emergency support. I think
Alfred too.
And the Alfred as well, yeah.
We might put some of those links in the speaker notes, because I think being aware of those services is really, really important, and encouraging families to, not be scared to approach those services. They have their own triaging. And when we're talking about eating disorders, there's obviously a huge mental health component. So the GP, I guess, is trained to do that triaging and say, look, you actually need to present to ED, or you would benefit from a Medicare plan. And there is Medicare sessions under an eating disorder plan. Do you know what that's called?
I think it was eating disorders management plan. I honestly think,
and you can get, I think it was in 12 months, up to 20 sessions that focus on psychological support. And then I think it was another 10 sessions with a dietitian.
Okay, great. And I think that that's important for families to be aware that they can access alongside OT.
Yeah.
And to really look at the benefits of dietitians, and also referring to dietitians that are experienced in, if you've got ARFID or your child's being explored for ARFID, experienced in that, or if your child has lots of complex challenges that are sensory associated with autism, for example, referring to someone who's experienced in that, because I know families have come to us and said they've had no benefit with certain dietitians because the approach has been, well, they need to be eating more of this, that and the other, and not taking into consideration the strong preferences, often related to sensory, that some of the autistic kids that we support need to navigate. And the really good dietitians often help families they should really alleviate that pressure and talk about more like macronutrients and just making sure that the child is actually sustaining their weight and growing, as opposed to fixating on those micronutrients. We can kind of get there. It's baby steps sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, I remember speaking to a dietitian on the phone and was getting her input on what foods, if any, we should be introducing next. And it was like she was an OT almost. She had really, really good critical thinking skills, but she understood that just deciding to, introduce foods from the 3 food groups probably wasn't going to work because this child was so picky. So it was looking at sensory properties of foods that they already liked and matching that with ones that was similar and then starting there. So I think, that
ties nicely into intervention, I suppose. We've spoken about the importance of setting good goals and referring on when we need to, particularly when it's meeting threshold for significant psychological concerns or, eating disorders. But other things that we approach actually within therapy, when we've decided it's within our scope and the family needs support on a holistic level, what kinds of things should we be thinking about when it comes to intervention?
I often start with once we've done in the assessment, talking about the difference between mealtimes and feeding practice, often my sessions look a lot like modelling what feeding practice looks like. And I guess actually coming back to your point, Mick, on how you're talking to the dietitian that supported you to maybe choose some food groups, that is really helpful as we begin feeding practice, because then I know what foods to sort of set up to help, I guess, support success and support the likelihood of the child being able to actually engage and integrate those foods into their diet down the track. But typically for me, feeding practice does look a lot like choosing maybe 3 to 5 foods at a time. And it is carefully chosen based on maybe foods that have been non-preferred, but maybe similar consistencies or textures to foods that are already in their safe food diet. And really starting from the bottom of the steps to eating. And we were just talking about it before, and I think we'll put in the speaker notes, but there's 32 steps to eating. And I think reminding families as well that eating is like a skill and it takes time to develop those skills. And so being okay with starting at the bottom, which could just be looking at the food and talking about everything that we see, using really neutral language and just really supporting the child and the family to use that same language, staying away from yuck and yum terms, but what can you see? And then moving up, and that could just then be, can we touch it? Can we then put it on our lips or our face, or even just hold it near our face to smell? And using, depending on the age of the child and their interests, but play-based approach and quite a lighthearted and a lighthearted approach to then engaging in something that's actually we're reducing that stress of engaging in something that's really tricky for the kid.
I think also being aware and knowing the child well and leaning into what the parent knows about the child, but how we respond when the child does make gains as well. Yeah. Especially, I know we support a lot of PDAs here, and over responding it's already a demand for a lot of our kids even eating. So we've got to be really careful, because sometimes it's we would just want to scream on the inside because we're oh my gosh, they tried that. Whereas other kids really love to have a bit of a cheer squad around them. So I think being aware of that within feeding therapy can be really important as well. Is there anything else that you really think about when you are doing a session looking at giving strategies or providing intervention? What do you do when you're perhaps exploring a food? How do we get that transference outside of the clinic setting, or where we have supported them even in the home? What's the next steps? Because like any skill, we've got our idea or our skill acquisition, but generalization is often way down the road. What are we thinking about?
I like to ask quite directly for a family to be really honest with me and tell me how frequently they actually can do feeding practice at home. A lot of the kids on my caseload have multiple therapies. They go to swimming, their siblings have to do swimming. So suddenly 5 nights of the week are actually really busy, and coming home from school and doing feeding practice actually isn't the best time to do it. So I think getting that transparency from the start, so that I guess if they are only going to do it once or twice a week, then it's going to take longer to progress towards the goal. But if we know that, then we can again set realistic expectations around what to expect, I guess. So I think that's important. And I think just always coming back to what the goal actually is. The goal might not be eating, it might be just learning the skill of trying different foods, and that might just be where the family is up to. But once people have achieved that goal, then it might be moving towards actually eating and swallowing foods, and then it changes the whole course of what your therapy meals look like and how that's practiced at home. Yeah,
I know SOS particularly talks a lot about feeding practice first and being quite separate to meal times and family meal times. Why is that?
It's a good question. I think it relates back to the fact that feeding is a skill and it has to be learnt. So by practicing in a very controlled setting, there's opportunities to practice that, and then your meal times are actually then for eating and getting the child's belly full and giving them their preferred foods and reducing stress.
Yeah, and I think it also helps the child understand the expectations on them and, therefore reduce that stress to be able to learn a new skill, which is a very tricky skill, particularly for a lot of our kids. But the expectations are really clear for them, and we can make that really distinct difference between the two. They're probably also more likely to engage in meal times, knowing that, mum and dad aren't going to introduce new foods here, and they're not stressed about that. They're just going to eat, and that's all we expect from that in that setting. And so I think that is really helpful for them as well.
It's like with fine motor skills, isn't it? We can focus on therapy because we're learning a new thing, we're working on new letters, or we're building versus trying to inject that into when the child's just wanting to do some colouring and fun. And I think it's the same with any skill we work on. It's so important that they have the opportunity to know that this is, skill development. We're learning something new versus mealtimes is a nice family time, and it's where you should feel safe and confident and be able to actually just explore meal types and get intake that works for you. I think that when it comes to supporting families more holistically, alongside obviously referral out, do you think sometimes that's where group therapy can be really helpful, feeding groups, and because kids are often more willing than at home to do practice?
Yeah, I think there's lots of evidence around the effectiveness of feeding groups. And I think in that joint space, again, it's fun, modelling off each other, often more likely to try it. I think they're really great.
And normalising challenges.
Yeah.
Kids like to see that they're not the only one. They might just have siblings that just down everything, whereas being around other kids where they also have a tough time with feeding, I think can be really powerful as well. Funding can be a challenge when it comes to different services, especially for kids if it's what falls under the NDIS, and that can be quite challenging to navigate in terms of getting support. So it's really important, I think, that we relate this in our reporting to function and how much this plays into participation and long-term functional outcomes. But separating that out from the mental health components and trying to support families to access support where they can through public health and through Medicare funded items as well. Is there anything else that you want to share with clinicians specifically around confidence, or where they can look for more training or support to feel more confident in this space?
I did the SOS PD this year, and I thought that was really, really great. And I think the more different, I guess, the different feeding PDs that you do, you can take things from each and every one of them and then apply it to the child that you've got in front of you. Obviously, every kid is different. So I think if you can, I guess, critically analyze everything that you're hearing on most things and then take the bits that you think are going to work best for that kid, then I think you'll find that instead of it being like a cookie cutter, like this is how you're meant to do it, if you can be flexible within the different approaches, then you'll see success.
And we know that the evidence is some of it's quite old or limited, and that research into particularly ARFID, but feeding challenges in general and the best approach, SOS has kind of always been viewed as that kind of gold standard because it is quite a structured program, so it's quite easy to, I guess, study.
Yeah.
And when it comes to feeding, there is quite limited evidence in a lot of ways. So I guess when we're talking about evidence-based practice, we always bang on about that, that it comes down to the client values, your clinical practice and the circumstances in which you practice, and whether you have a multi-disc team, whether you need to refer on, what is within your scope, then also looking at the best evidence available to us, and then I guess your clinical expertise. And all of those things are what make up our clinical reasoning. So we need to tap into all of that. So I really liked what you said around SOS training. Yes, that builds a lot of confidence, and I know a lot of practitioners do that training and love it, but it
doesn't suit every child.
no,
I think
it doesn't
that's what
take
we
every
found when we were
workplace.
doing it.
Yeah.
So if we only think that you can only go to clinics where it's multi-disc and they offer SOS, that's not going to support the majority of our clients that, I guess, it's an ADL. We need to be supporting all our clients with this. And that comes down to things in the same way that we would support sleep or anything like that. So yes, do your further training. We'll put some links to a couple that, we know of. But I think the key messaging is that we need to be asking this. Don't shy away from it. Assess thoroughly, refer on, pull on your different resources, and set good goals. I know we're obsessed with goals.
Yeah, assessment and goals, that will frame your whole therapy
intervention
program.
and where you send kids and what confidence you have in that.
Back yourself in that. If you think that you've got to take longer in that assessment phase, and maybe the family's really keen to get started, but know the reason that you're doing that is because the more you know, the easier it's going to be to actually support them with implementing or achieving their feeding goals. But I think don't rush through that period, because that is there's so many questions to answer.
I think if we circle back to what we spoke about at the start and the fear sometimes around working on meal times, I think a takeaway as well is if you aren't sure, and using the example of referring someone for an oral motor assessment, if nothing comes back from that, that is information in itself that is not the reason why the feeding challenge is occurring. So it's still information that is useful, I think. So
100%.
Don't shy away from, I guess, not referring on if you're not 100% sure what's going on.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we hope that was helpful. We'll pop some links in the speaker notes, but give it a go. Tap into your multi-disc team and refer on when you need to. But ultimately, as long as you're setting really good goals and breaking down your observation and your assessment phase well, there are differences that all clinicians working with kids with feeding challenges can make. So see you next time.
Thanks, Jack.
Bye.
Bye.